He had lived quietly for years in a small town that most people passed through without ever remembering the name. His house sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by tall oaks and the soft hum of cicadas that filled the air every evening. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another man who had found a bit of peace in a world that rarely offered it. He kept to himself, not because he was unfriendly, but because he didn't have much to say anymore. There were things in his past that didn't fit into casual talk. He didn't talk about what he had done or where he had been. He didn't brag or complain. He just lived quietly, as if the silence was his best friend. The man's days followed a steady rhythm. He would wake before sunrise when the sky was still a deep blue and the air smelled fresh. The first sound anyone might hear from his property was the click of a metal latch and the soft bark of a dog. That was his companion, Shadow, a strong, dark-coated Belgian Malinois with eyes that looked almost human. Shadow had once served alongside him. They had been through places and situations that most people could never imagine. But that was a long time ago. Now Shadow was more than a dog to him. He was family. A reason to wake up, to stay grounded, to find calm in simple moments. Every morning the man would pour a cup of black coffee, step onto his porch, and watch the fog roll across the field. Shadow would sit beside him, waiting for the quiet signal to begin their training. It wasn't really training anymore, not like the old days. It was more like a ritual, a shared language between two souls who understood each other without words. They would walk to the back field, where the grass was still wet from dew. The man would toss a small rubber ball into the air, and Shadow would spring after it, moving with a precision that came from years of discipline. Sometimes the man would give hand signals, testing the old drills: sit, stay, come, heel. Shadow never forgot. He never missed a command. The neighbors often watched from a distance. Some were curious, some admired the bond between the man and his dog, and others found it strange. To them, he was a quiet man with military posture, who always wore plain clothes and kept his yard spotless. Some said he was ex-military. Others thought he worked for security. Nobody really knew, and he never corrected them. In the afternoons, he would fix things around the house: the porch railing, the old shed door, the fence that ran along the edge of his yard. He liked keeping his hands busy. It kept his mind from drifting too far back. Shadow would follow him everywhere, lying in the shade nearby, ears twitching at every sound. When evening came, the man would cook a simple meal, usually something like chicken, rice, and vegetables. He always made an extra portion for Shadow. Then they'd sit outside again, watching the sunset fade behind the trees. Shadow would rest his head on the man's knee, and for a while there was peace. But the quiet life, as peaceful as it seemed, carried a heaviness. Sometimes at night the man would wake from dreams that didn't feel like dreams. The sound of helicopters, the crack of gunfire, the feeling of sand in his teeth, and always the echo of voices, some gone forever. When that happened, Shadow would climb onto the bed, pressing close to him until his breathing slowed. The dog seemed to know when the past tried to pull him back. He didn't talk much to people in town, but when he did, he was polite. The woman at the diner always asked if he wanted the usual: black coffee and scrambled eggs. The cashier at the hardware store would nod and say, "Good morning." That was enough for him. He didn't need more than that. To most people, he was invisible, and that was how he liked it. He had done enough living for 2 lifetimes. He wasn't looking for recognition or pity. He just wanted normal days. Days where the biggest concern was fixing a broken fence or mowing the lawn. But even in quiet towns, life has a way of testing people when they least expect it. It started on a warm Thursday morning. The man had taken Shadow for his usual walk down the dirt road. They passed by a few houses, the same ones they always did. He liked walking early before most people woke up. Shadow stayed close to his side, tail relaxed, scanning everything around them like a guardian on duty. When they returned home, he opened the gate and let Shadow run around the yard while he refilled the water bowl. It was nothing unusual. A few minutes later, the mail truck came by. The sound of the engine made Shadow perk up, tail wagging as he watched it roll past. What happened next wasn't dramatic. It was one of those small, ordinary moments that no one notices until it changes everything. The latch on the side gate hadn't closed properly. Maybe the man had been distracted. Maybe the hinge was worn from age. Whatever the reason, Shadow nudged it open and trotted out onto the road. The man noticed seconds later. He called out calmly the way he always did. "Shadow, come!" The dog stopped, looked back, and began to return. But at that same moment, a passing driver saw the dog and swerved slightly, honking the horn. The sudden noise startled Shadow, and he turned, trotting further down the road instead. The man moved quickly but didn't run. He knew Shadow would respond better to calm than panic. What he didn't know was that someone down the street had already made a phone call. A neighbor, new to the area, had seen Shadow and didn't recognize him. To them, he looked big, alert, and intimidating. They didn't know that he was trained, obedient, and gentle unless commanded otherwise. The neighbor told the police there was a dangerous-looking dog wandering around. The man managed to get Shadow back inside within a few minutes. He locked the gate properly this time and gave the dog a gentle pat on the head. "You're getting too curious," he said softly, almost smiling. Shadow tilted his head as if he understood. He thought that was the end of it. Later that afternoon, he sat on the porch again with a glass of cold water, the sound of cicadas filling the air. Shadow lay beside him, eyes half closed, breathing slow and steady. It felt like another quiet day. Then he saw the patrol car coming down the road. It wasn't unusual to see police in the area now and then, but this time 2 cars stopped right in front of his gate. The man stood slowly, sensing something off. 2 officers stepped out, hands resting near their belts. "Afternoon, sir," one of them called. "We got a report about a loose dog in the area. You happen to know anything about that?" The man nodded. "That was earlier this morning. He got out for a minute, but I've got him secured now." The officers glanced toward the yard. Shadow stood beside his owner, tail still but body alert. He wasn't growling or barking, just watching. "Mind if we take a look?" the other officer asked. The man frowned slightly but didn't argue. "Sure," he said, stepping aside. He knew they were just doing their job, but he also knew how quickly people misread situations like this. Shadow stayed close, his eyes following every movement. The man gave a hand signal for him to stay calm. The dog obeyed instantly, lowering his head slightly. One of the officers smiled nervously. "That's a big one." "What breed?" "Belgian Malinois," the man said. "Trained. Very disciplined." The officers nodded, but the tension was there, floating between them. One of them radioed something in quietly. The man felt his stomach tighten. He didn't like being watched this closely. It reminded him of checkpoints and interrogations from another life. After a few minutes, they seemed satisfied and left. The man watched the cars disappear down the road. He exhaled slowly, rubbed Shadow's neck, and whispered, "It's all right. Just a misunderstanding." That night he couldn't sleep. The sound of the police radios, the way they looked at Shadow, the unease in their eyes, it stayed with him. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, but something in his gut told him this wasn't the last of it. The next morning came with another sunrise, another cup of coffee, another walk in the field. From the outside, nothing seemed different. But inside, the man felt a small shift, a warning, quiet but clear. He had lived long enough to know that peace is fragile, that it can vanish without warning. He looked down at Shadow, who trotted beside him, loyal as ever. "We'll be fine," he said under his breath. "We always are," Shadow barked once, as if agreeing. For now, the world was still calm. But somewhere beyond that gravel road, a report sat on a desk, and someone was asking questions about a dangerous dog. The man didn't know it yet, but his peaceful life, his quiet home, his simple days with Shadow, was standing on the edge of something that would change everything. The following week began quietly. The man followed his usual routine, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over him after the officer's visit. He fixed the latch on the side gate, tightening every screw twice. Then he added a second chain, just to be sure. He told himself it was just precaution, but deep down, he knew he was trying to make the world predictable again. Shadow didn't seem bothered. He was the same as always, alert, loyal, and ready to follow every signal his owner gave. The man admired that about him. No matter how uncertain life became, Shadow moved through each day with confidence. Each morning the man would wake before the sun, sit on the porch, and let the quiet fill him. He had always found peace in that moment between night and day, when the world still felt half asleep. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets fading and the distant call of a bird. But that week, he noticed things he hadn't before. A car that slowed near his property and then drove off. A couple of neighbors watching a bit too long as he walked Shadow down the road. The sound of whispers at the grocery store when he walked by with his usual list in hand. He didn't like attention. Attention had never brought him anything good. Shadow seemed to sense the change, too. Whenever someone new passed by the fence, the dog would stand tall, eyes steady, body calm but watchful. He didn't bark unless there was a reason. Still, some people didn't understand the difference between a dog being protective and a dog being aggressive. One afternoon, the man was cleaning out the shed when he heard a knock on the front door. He wiped his hands and stepped out, finding 2 animal control officers standing there. They were polite but distant, the way people are when they've already decided something before the conversation even begins. "Sir, we received another report about your dog," one of them said. Apparently, someone claims it was seen off-leash again. The man frowned. "That's not possible. The gate's been fixed. He hasn't left the yard." The officer nodded. "We believe you. But since we've had multiple calls, we just need to check that everything's secure." The man didn't argue. He led them to the backyard and showed them the reinforced latch, the tall fence, and the dog sitting calmly near the porch. Shadow watched the strangers but didn't move. "He's well trained," the man said quietly. "He's not a threat to anyone." The younger officer smiled awkwardly. "He's a fine-looking dog, just people get nervous, you know." "I understand," the man replied. He did understand, even if it hurt. People were often afraid of what they didn't know. And Shadow didn't look like the kind of dog who wagged his tail at strangers. When they left, the man sat on the steps with Shadow and stared at the fence for a long time. "We're all right," he murmured. "We'll just keep to ourselves." The next few days passed without any more visits. He almost started to relax again. He took Shadow for early walks when the roads were empty, careful to keep him on a strong leash. They trained in the field behind the house, working through simple commands. Shadow loved it, the movement, the focus, the praise. It was the one part of life that still felt right. But tension has a way of finding quiet places. That Friday, the sky was overcast. The air felt heavy, like it carried a warning. The man had been fixing a loose board on the porch when he noticed a police cruiser turn into the road again. He sighed, setting his hammer down. 2 officers stepped out. These weren't the same ones who'd come before. They looked younger, unfamiliar, a bit uneasy. One of them had his hand resting near his holster, not threatening, just cautious. "Afternoon," the man greeted, keeping his tone even. "Sir," one officer said, "we've had another complaint. Someone said your dog was acting aggressive through the fence." The man blinked. "Through the fence?" "Yes, sir." Growling and lunging at someone who was walking by. He looked at Shadow, who sat quietly beside him, tail still. "He guards the property, that's all. He doesn't leave it. He doesn't attack." The officer nodded, but his expression stayed stiff. "We just need to verify that again." As they walked toward the yard, Shadow stood and moved slightly forward, his instinct telling him to stay between his owner and the strangers. The man raised his hand gently, signaling the dog to stay calm. "It's all right," he said softly. "Stay." Shadow obeyed instantly, but the officer's body language changed. They tensed. To them, the dog looked big, powerful, unpredictable. One of them muttered something under his breath. The man felt the tension rise like static in the air. "Please don't move suddenly," he said, his voice calm but firm. "He's trained. He won't harm you if you stay still." The officer nodded, but his partner looked nervous. He stepped back slightly, hand hovering near his weapon again. The man felt something cold settle in his chest. He had seen that look before, not here, but in other places far away. It was the look of someone who didn't understand what they were seeing but was ready to react out of fear. "Let's not do this," the man said quietly. "He's behind the fence. You can talk to me from here." The older of the 2 officers hesitated, then nodded. They asked a few more questions about Shadow's vaccinations, license, and training. The man answered everyone calmly. After a few minutes, they seemed satisfied again and left. When they drove away, the man sat down slowly on the porch. He rubbed his forehead, feeling the weight of it all. "You didn't do anything wrong," he told Shadow. "But they don't see you the way I do." Shadow rested his head on the man's knee as if trying to comfort him. The touch made his chest ache. The next few days passed quietly again. The man avoided going into town. He bought groceries once a week and kept his distance from neighbors. He didn't want trouble. He only wanted to live in peace with his dog. But trouble has a way of showing up even when you hide from it. One Saturday morning, He was out back repairing the old fence post when he heard voices from the road. Two teenagers were walking by, talking loudly. Shadow barked once, not angry, just alert. The man called him off immediately and the barking stopped. The boys laughed and kept walking. He thought nothing of it. Later that afternoon, though, he noticed a different car slowing near his house again. A man he didn't recognize rolled down his window and took a picture of the property before driving off. He didn't like that. That evening, he called the local non-emergency line, asking if there had been another complaint about his dog. The woman on the phone said there hadn't been, at least not that day. He thanked her and hung up, trying to convince himself that he was imagining things, but he couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on him. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The old house creaked with every breeze, and the distant sound of cars passing on the highway made him restless. He turned his head and saw Shadow curled up near the door, keeping watch as always. "You're the only one who gets it," he whispered. Shadow lifted his head for a moment, then went back to sleep. The next morning, the man felt determined to carry on like normal. He made breakfast, took Shadow out, and then worked in the garden. The air was cool and quiet. For a few hours, it almost felt like things had gone back to normal. Around noon, a neighbor stopped by the fence. It was an older man who lived a few houses down. "Heard the cops came by again," the neighbor said casually. "You doing all right?" The man nodded. "We're fine. Just misunderstandings." The neighbor leaned on the fence, glancing at Shadow. "He's a good-looking animal, strong. Folks around here just aren't used to seeing dogs like that. Some of them get nervous easy." "I know," the man said softly. "He's trained. He won't hurt anyone." "I believe that," the neighbor replied. "But not everyone does. You might want to keep him inside more often, just in case." The man thanked him for the advice, though it stung a little. He watched as the neighbor walked away, then looked down at Shadow. "Guess we're not welcome here the way I thought," he murmured. That evening he stayed on the porch longer than usual. The air was still heavy with humidity. Fireflies flickered across the yard like tiny sparks. Shadow lay at his feet, eyes half closed. The man reached down, running a hand over the dog's head. "You've been with me longer than anyone," he said quietly. "We've been through worse. We'll get through this too." He wanted to believe that. But deep down, a small voice whispered that something was building, something he couldn't control this time. Before going inside, he checked the locks, the fence, the gate, everything. Then he sat by the window, just watching the road. In the distance, he saw headlights pause near his driveway for a moment before disappearing into the night. He stayed awake long after Shadow had fallen asleep, listening to the crickets and the sound of his own heartbeat. For years, he had lived quietly, asking for nothing from anyone. He had served, sacrificed, and walked away from a life most people couldn't begin to understand. All he wanted now was peace. But peace, he was learning, could be as fragile as glass, and once it cracked, it was almost impossible to make whole again. He didn't know it then, but that night was the last calm night he would have for a long time. The morning started like any other. The man woke early, made his coffee, and stepped out onto the porch where the air still held the coolness of dawn. Shadow was already awake, sitting by the door waiting for the signal to start their usual morning routine. The man smiled softly and gave a short whistle. Shadow stood, stretching his legs before trotting down the steps. Together they moved across the field behind the house, the grass glistening with dew. The man tossed a ball and Shadow darted after it with his usual energy, returning it every time without fail. It was a simple routine, but it meant everything to him. These moments reminded him that life could still be peaceful, that not every day had to carry the weight of old memories. By mid-morning, the sky had turned bright and clear. The man was sitting on the porch again when a sound in the distance caught his attention, the low hum of a car engine slowing down. He looked toward the road and saw another patrol car approaching. His chest tightened. Two officers stepped out, neither of whom he recognized. They seemed cautious but polite. One of them called out, "Sir, can we have a word?" He nodded and set his coffee aside. "Sure, what's this about?" The officers exchanged a quick glance. "We received a follow-up about the previous calls regarding your dog," one explained. "Just routine, sir. We're checking in." The man tried to stay calm. "He's here safe behind the fence like always." They nodded, but their eyes wandered toward the yard where Shadow was lying quietly in the shade. His ears perked up watching the strangers. "Can we see him a bit closer?" the younger officer asked. The man hesitated. "He's fine where he is. He doesn't like being approached by people he doesn't know." The older officer stepped forward slightly. "We just need to verify his tag and check his behavior, sir." "Won't take a minute." The man didn't like it. He'd dealt with too many tense situations before. Not here, but in places far more dangerous. He knew when a situation could turn bad from nothing more than unease and misunderstanding. Still, he wanted to cooperate. He didn't want trouble. "All right," he said finally. "Let me get his leash." He went inside to fetch it, calling out softly to Shadow. The dog stood, tail low but body relaxed. He clipped the leash on and led him out toward the fence where the officers waited. Shadow stayed calm, his eyes focused on his owner's face. The man kept his tone steady, his body language calm. He knew how much energy flowed between a person and their dog. One wrong signal and things could spiral. "He's trained," the man said quietly. "He won't harm anyone." The younger officer gave a tight smile. "He's a beautiful animal, just trying to keep everyone safe." The man nodded, though he felt the words carry an edge of misunderstanding. "I understand," he said simply. The older officer leaned slightly toward the gate, holding out a hand as if to test Shadow's reaction. Shadow didn't move, just watched closely. The man said firmly, "Don't reach toward him, please." The officer paused, hand still in midair, then pulled it back with an awkward smile. "Of course. Just being friendly." After a few more questions, they thanked him and left. The man stood at the gate, watching the cars drive off until the dust settled again. He turned to Shadow. "You did good," he murmured, giving him a pat. "You stayed calm." But the peace that followed didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like waiting. He could sense something building, like a storm gathering far off that hadn't yet shown itself. The next few days were tense. He tried to keep to his normal schedule, walks, chores, quiet evenings, but his mind wandered. He kept checking the road every time he heard an engine. Shadow noticed the change in him and stayed closer than usual, always between his owner and the outside world. One afternoon, he decided to drive into town for supplies. He needed dog food, groceries, and a few tools. The hardware store clerk greeted him with the same polite smile as always, but he could feel the difference in people's eyes. Conversations paused when he walked past. He pretended not to notice. When he returned home, Shadow greeted him with excitement, circling once before sitting obediently as the man unloaded the bags. He smiled faintly and said, "You're the only one who doesn't change on me." That night, as the sun dipped below the trees, he sat on the porch again. The sound of crickets filled the air. He let the memories come, faces of old teammates, dusty roads, long nights in places where safety was only ever borrowed, never guaranteed. He had been through worse. But this felt different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was supposed to be home. The following morning, he decided to visit the local sheriff's office himself. He wanted to clear the air, to explain that his dog was trained, licensed, and safe. Maybe if he spoke directly, the calls would stop. The woman at the front desk listened patiently, then said she'd pass the message along. "Sometimes people overreact," she said kindly. "Small-town things. Don't take it too personally." He thanked her and left, hoping that would be the end of it. When he got back home, Shadow was waiting by the gate as always. The man let out a slow breath, feeling the tension lift slightly. He spent the rest of the day repairing the old shed, sanding down a wooden bench and letting Shadow nap nearby. For a few hours, the peace returned, but peace never stayed for long anymore. Late that afternoon, a delivery truck pulled up. Shadow barked once, a deep, sharp sound, and stood near the gate. The driver hesitated, clearly nervous. The man waved him in, keeping a firm hold on the leash. The package was dropped off quickly, and the driver left without small talk. After that, the man stood at the gate for a long while, staring down the empty road. He couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow's presence, which once made him feel safe, was now the reason people were afraid of him. That night, he sat by the window, lights off, watching the faint glow of passing cars. He didn't like being suspicious, but something deep inside told him that things were shifting again, and not in his favor. The next morning, it happened. He was out in the yard, fixing a loose plank near the gate, when Shadow suddenly lifted his head and gave a low growl. The man looked up to see another patrol car rolling to a stop in front of his house. This time, 3 officers stepped out. He recognized one from before. The man stood slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Morning," he called, trying to sound calm. "Morning, sir," the familiar officer replied. "We got another call. Someone reported that your dog scared a jogger on the road." The man frowned. "He hasn't been outside the fence." The officer nodded. "We understand, but we need to follow up." Shadow stood beside his owner, quiet but alert. His ears twitched as the officers approached the gate. "Stay," the man said softly, and Shadow obeyed immediately. The officers talked for a few minutes, asking the same questions again, about the dog's behavior, about safety, about whether he'd consider keeping the animal indoors more often. He answered every question calmly, but he could see the doubt in their eyes. To them, Shadow wasn't a companion or a trained partner. He was a risk. The older officer glanced at Shadow again. "He looks strong," he said. "You train him yourself?" The man hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, years of training. He listens to every command. He's better trained than most people I've known." There was a small pause. Something in his tone carried a quiet authority that made the officers exchange a look. The familiar officer cleared his throat. "All right, sir. We'll make a note. Just try to keep an eye out. Some folks here don't feel safe." "I've been keeping an eye out my whole life," the man said softly. When they left, he stood in silence for a long time. Shadow pressed close to his leg, sensing the tension. The man looked down, rubbing his head. "They don't understand you," he whispered. "They don't understand what you've done, what you've been through. But that's all right. We'll keep our heads down." That evening, he sat outside again. The sunset painted the sky in soft orange light, and the world seemed calm for a moment. Shadow lay at his feet, eyes half closed, breathing slow. He thought about how different life was now. Years ago, people had trusted him with their lives. They had depended on his judgment, his calm, his skill, and now he couldn't even convince a few neighbors that his dog was safe. He let out a slow breath and leaned back in the chair. "Maybe this is how the world works," he murmured. "People forget who you were once you stop being useful." Shadow lifted his head and looked at him, as if trying to remind him that not everyone forgets. The man smiled faintly. "You remember," he said. "That's enough." The night grew darker. The crickets sang, and the stars began to appear one by one. The man stayed outside long after the air cooled, long after the world had gone still. For now there was quiet again. But deep down, he knew it was only the calm before something else. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones, the same instinct that had saved him countless times before. It wasn't fear exactly. It was awareness, the kind that came from years of seeing how small moments could change everything. He looked down at Shadow once more, his hand resting gently on the dog's head. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "we face it together." The dog closed his eyes, peaceful and steady, trusting the only person he had ever known completely. Inside the house, the man's phone buzzed with a new message, one that would pull him back into the world he thought he had left behind for good. The message came early in the morning, before sunrise. The man was sitting on the porch, as he often did, holding a mug of black coffee and watching the fog drift over the field. Shadow sat beside him, alert but calm, as if waiting for the day's first signal. When the phone buzzed, the man glanced at it, expecting a random notification. But the number was familiar, one he hadn't seen in years. He hesitated before answering. A quiet voice came through the line. "It's been a while," the caller said. The man didn't reply at first. The voice brought back too many memories. Desert winds, whispered commands, long nights that never seemed to end. Finally, he said, "It has. I saw your name come up," the caller continued. "Something about a situation in your town. You doing all right?" The man's jaw tightened. "I'm fine. Just some people who don't understand." The voice paused, then said, "You were one of the best, you know that. Don't let them forget who you are." He didn't answer. The conversation ended soon after. When he hung up, he sat there in silence, feeling the old world pressing against the new one. Two lives that never should have crossed again. Shadow nudged his hand gently, sensing the shift in his mood. The man smiled faintly and rubbed the dog's head. "It's all right," he murmured. "That was just someone from before." He tried to go about his day as usual. He worked in the yard, mowed the grass, cleaned the shed. But the phone call had stirred something in him. Not fear, but awareness. He knew his record, his background, his service. If people started digging into his name, it wouldn't stay quiet for long. By afternoon, the sky had turned gray. Clouds gathered low and thunder rumbled somewhere far away. The man stood at the edge of his yard watching the sky when a car pulled up. It wasn't a police cruiser this time. It was an unmarked sedan. A man stepped out wearing plain clothes. He looked like a government worker or maybe a reporter. His shoes were too clean for small-town roads. "Afternoon," the stranger said, approaching the gate. The man didn't move closer. "Can I help you?" The stranger offered a polite smile. "I'm doing a piece on veterans who've transitioned to civilian life. Your name came up. I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk." The man shook his head. "No interviews. I keep to myself." The stranger didn't push. "I understand. But I think people should know your story. You've served this country with distinction. There aren't many like you left." "I didn't do it for stories," the man said quietly. The stranger nodded and left a card on the fence. "If you change your mind, give me a call." When he drove away, the man stared at the card for a long moment before tossing it into the trash. He didn't want attention. He didn't want people digging through his past, turning it into something public. But news has a way of traveling on its own. 2 days later, a local article appeared online. It wasn't much, just a short piece about a retired special operations soldier living quietly in the county. It didn't use his name, but the hints were clear enough for people nearby to guess. Soon the whispers in town changed tone. Some people became curious, even respectful. Others looked at him differently with suspicion or quiet resentment. The same neighbors who had once just waved politely now either crossed the street or stared a little too long. The man tried to ignore it, but it was impossible not to notice the shift. One morning at the diner, the waitress who usually smiled and asked about Shadow looked uneasy. "I read something about you," she said softly. "Is it true? You used to be in one of those special units." He nodded once. "A long time ago." She hesitated. "I just didn't know. You seem so quiet." "That's the point," he said, managing a small smile. After that, conversations around him became more careful. Some people offered him free coffee or thanked him for his service. Others looked away when he entered the room. He didn't want either. He wanted to go back to being invisible. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, he sat on the porch again with Shadow. The air felt thick, heavy with change. He could feel his peaceful life slipping through his fingers. Not because of anything he'd done wrong, but because people had begun to see him differently. He rubbed Shadow's neck and whispered, "Looks like they know now." The dog tilted his head, unaware of the weight of those words. Days passed, and the small story spread further than anyone expected. A few online veterans pages picked it up, adding details about missions and units that were once secret. The man didn't know how they got that information, but he guessed someone from the past had talked. And then came the media vans. It started with one parked near the end of the road, camera crew waiting for a glimpse of him. Then another came the next day. He ignored them, staying inside with Shadow, blinds closed. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to be a symbol or a story. He just wanted to live quietly. But curiosity is loud and peace is fragile. Neighbors who had once avoided him now came by, pretending to be friendly. "We didn't know you were a hero," one said. "You should tell people more about what you did." He shook his head. "It's not something I talk about." That night, as the rain began to fall, he sat by the window watching the reporters pack up their cameras. He thought about the years he'd spent overseas, how every mission ended with silence. No headlines, no applause, just the next sunrise and the same unspoken understanding among his team. You did your job and went home. Now, after all these years, strangers were trying to turn his silence into a story they could sell. He turned away from the window and sat on the floor beside Shadow, running a hand through the dog's fur. "You're the only one who gets it," he said softly. "The world doesn't understand quiet anymore." The days grew longer after that. Reporters left, but the attention didn't. More people wanted to talk, some from the military, some from advocacy groups. The sheriff himself stopped by one afternoon saying, "Didn't realize who you were. Wish we'd known sooner." The man just nodded, not sure what that meant. Even the officers who had once come to question him treated him differently now. They were polite, respectful even. But it felt hollow. He didn't want their respect. He wanted to be left alone. One morning, he went into town for groceries. A group of young men at the store recognized him and asked for a photo. He declined, but they insisted, saying, "You're a legend, man." He smiled politely and walked away. In his mind, all he could think was how strange it was that people celebrated what they didn't understand. They wanted the image, not the reality. Not the long nights, not the faces that never came back. That night, as he sat outside with Shadow, the crickets sang louder than usual. The world was quiet again, but not peaceful. His story was out there now, and nothing could pull it back. A few weeks later, a package arrived at his doorstep. There was no name on it, just an old military seal stamped on the corner. Inside was a medal he had earned decades ago, one he never collected. Alongside it was a note from his old commanding officer. "You've earned your rest. Don't let them take it from you." He stared at the medal for a long time before putting it in a drawer. He didn't want reminders. He wanted mornings with Shadow, quiet walks, and the simple rhythm of ordinary life. But the world didn't forget. The article had sparked debates online, and a few people began showing up at his property, asking questions or trying to film videos. Some even shouted from the road, wanting him to come out and talk. He stayed inside most days now. He'd seen enough of the world to know that fame, even the quiet kind, could turn into chaos. One afternoon, a letter arrived from a local veterans group inviting him to speak at a memorial event. He read it carefully, then set it aside. Shadow sat by his feet watching him. "What do you think?" the man asked softly. "Should we go?" Shadow tilted his head, his tail thumping once against the floor. The man smiled faintly. "Maybe not. We'll stay here." The next morning, he woke early again, the same way he always did. He poured his coffee, stepped onto the porch, and looked out at the field. Shadow sat beside him, eyes bright, waiting for the signal to begin the day. He thought about how life had changed, how a quiet man and his dog had become the center of attention without ever wanting to be. He thought about how people now saw him as something larger than life, when all he ever wanted was to live small and unseen. As the sun rose, he whispered, "They can call me whatever they want. I just want my peace back." Shadow pressed his head against the man's knee. It was his way of saying that, in this moment, peace still existed, at least between the two of them. The man smiled, breathing in the morning air. "That's enough," he said quietly. "That's all we ever needed." For the first time in weeks, he felt calm again. The noise, the attention, the stories, none of it mattered here. Just a man, a dog, and the soft light of another day beginning. But even as the world settled back into its rhythm, he knew one truth deep in his heart. Once the world takes notice of you, it never completely looks away. And though he didn't know it yet, the attention that had once felt harmless was about to change everything once more, in a way neither he nor Shadow could have seen coming. The days began to grow shorter. The mornings carried a chill that hinted at the coming winter, and the trees in the field behind the house had started to lose their color. The man woke up before dawn, as always, his body still trained to rise with the first light. Shadow stirred at the sound of his footsteps, tail brushing against the floor. The man smiled faintly. "Another day, boy," he said softly, pouring water into the dog's bowl. Outside, mist floated low over the ground. The world was quiet again, or at least quieter than it had been in weeks. The reporters had mostly moved on. The excitement had faded, as it always does. Only the silence remained, the kind of silence the man understood best. But something inside him had shifted. He didn't feel like the same person anymore. The attention, the calls, the interviews, and even the praise had reminded him of a part of his life he had tried hard to leave behind. People now looked at him with a mix of awe and sorrow, as if they couldn't decide whether to honor him or pity him. He wanted neither. That morning, as he sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, he thought about everything that had happened, about the years he had spent in places where peace was only a rumor, about the choices he had made and the ones he couldn't take back, about how somehow he had survived all that, only to end up here. Just a quiet man with a loyal dog, learning how to live in a world that moved too fast. Shadow rested his head on the man's knee. The man reached down and stroked his fur gently. "You know," he whispered, "you're the only one who never asked for anything. Just company. Just quiet." He smiled at that. It was true. Shadow didn't care about medals or stories or what anyone thought. He just wanted to be near him, to walk beside him, to share the silence.